Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming. I'm Saelan Twerdy. I'm a writer and a critic here in Montreal. And these are our guests. This is Aryen. Actually, why don't we start by having everybody introduce themselves, and also maybe just for a second talk about what your space is that you run and what the circumstances were that led to you opening it up.
Sure. My name's Aryen Hoekstra. I run a space in Toronto called Franz Kaka. We've been there since 2016, so it's almost 3 years that we've had the space. And I'll leave some of it to tell Kevin, but maybe one of the interesting things about the model of our gallery is that we share the space with another project, which is Towards Kevin's space. So we alternate our programming each month. Before opening the gallery, I was the director of another sort of artist-run space that was affiliated with a university called G Gallery, which the University of Guelph was funding. But there was it's challenging working with a sort of large bureaucratic institution in terms of maintaining funding, and an art gallery is a very hard sort of entity for them to quantify what the benefits of it were for the university. So in the summer of 2016, they decided that they would stop funding G Gallery in the city. And that was a space where I had my studio as well. And so at that time, I decided that the money I would be spending on a studio, I would instead sort of turn that into an exhibition space and sort of pitch to Kevin, who I knew was looking to have a physical space for this online publication he'd been running, and sort of came up with this model. Yeah.
Hi guys, I'm Kevin, and yes, I run a space called Towards. I think Ari did kind of a great job of highlighting the main points, but my background is in kind of traditionally in graphic design. I had always kind of been very interested in the arts in kind of a periphery role. Towards started as an online publication that focused on kind of longer, in-depth artist interviews. And we did that for a couple of years and kind of realized that collaborating with artists and working closely with them was something that was much more excited about. And kind of making the jump from an online publication to a physical space just opened up the opportunities for the types of collaborations and types of projects we could take on with the artists. So Ari, we'd known each other for a long time. We'd been friends. When he left G Gallery, we started talking about this opportunity to maybe find a physical space and how we could do that and what that might look like. And the result of that is kind of what we now call a timeshare method, where we both program 6 shows in the space a year, and we go back and forth and do that.
Hi, I'm Julie Côté from Projet Pangée. So we are very lucky that I'm a friend and worked also with Pierre-Laurent Boothe, who's an art dealer, who's European, and moved back to Europe, leaving a wonderful space in the Belgo, serving as storage. And after a little while, I got sickened. So I asked him if I could use the space. So luckily for us, he said yes, and he gave us carte blanche. The only rules was that we would not become a purely commercial gallery, that we would be involved in our community, both things that we wanted to do. Me and Joanie Tremblay, who started this space, but she joined me after 2 months of me running the space by myself. She's not with us anymore. She's focusing on her career in teaching, but she was there for at least the 2 first years. So we've been there for 3 years in total, and slowly growing. And I have also 2 other wonderful artists and associates, Michel Buy and Sophie Latouche, who are here at the fair working. Voilà. That's how it started.
All right, so my name is Marx, Ruiz-Wilson. I run Tab Art Space alongside my partner, Audrey. The space is a garage that we made into a show art space, basically. And so this project stems out of another project that I started a couple of years ago, which is a podcast in which I interview artists, curators, and different people in the contemporary arts. Julie is one of them, so you should go and listen to that. So my background is not in the arts, it's in the sciences. I'm a chemist by training. And so this is a different project on the side that we have. We started through friends. We got really interested in what all these spaces and what the community of the contemporary art brings to a community, and we try to do that in the space. So we try to form a community, and I think that in the space that we have, perhaps because of architecture and also perhaps because of where it is, it really makes that happen. We have some furniture that we take out every time we have an opening, and people can come there and just hang out and chat about their projects and about their ideas and whatever else happens in those shows. So that's a really quick introduction to the space.
I think we have a really nicely well-rounded panel because all four of you are coming from a slightly different background and a slightly different model. So you're coming from a university gallery, Aryen. Kevin, you're coming from like a design and publishing background. Julie, you're sort of coming from working with an art dealer. And Marx, you're coming from a sort of like non-art background, but also a podcast. And so something I wanted to ask you guys is, so this panel is called, or it's about alternative art spaces. So the sort of like big question I have looming in the background is like, what does it mean to you to be called an alternative art space? Is that something you would call yourself? And in like practical terms, how do you see your space and project as distinct from the world of official artist-run centers or from established commercial galleries? Like, what's distinct about what you're doing?
Well, I've been telling people this weekend that I was on this panel on alternative art spaces. So I've had to sort of work through and answer a couple times already of describing what an alternative space might be. And I guess sort of what I've come up with is that a lot of it is responding to sort of a limitation in terms of physical space. I can speak at least for Toronto, that real estate for artists is studios, but also just for any sort of new venture. It's real estate is very expensive, and there's sort of a scarcity of it within the pockets that have traditionally or sort of currently home to the art community in Toronto anyway. So in terms of an alternative, the space doesn't look so much like a traditional art space in that it's in the basement of a studio building. But having said that, all the walls are white, the floor is gray in a lot of ways. It would have really sort of like gallery type lighting. It's not that much of an alternative to what exhibition spaces look like if you think of them in their sort of like most generic sort of form. Mm-hmm. The ceilings are lower, the walls are kind of like rough. But I don't really consider it so much to be an alternative to these spaces. Perhaps we began more on the periphery, but the art world and art market is really good at sort of like infinitely expanding itself and sort of bringing anything that's on the periphery into this sort of expansive bubble. And so when we do art fairs in Montreal or Toronto or Miami or wherever we are, there's always other spaces that are sort of comparable to what we're doing that are also there presenting contemporary work, selling it, trying to pay for its operation through sales. The alternative that we are is that when we opened, we didn't represent any artists. We still don't, but there's now artists that we've worked with multiple times, and it's not a formal relationship, but there is sort of this like informal sort of recurrence of the characters that are sort of populating our programming as well. So it's not, I don't really go to the gallery every day thinking that it's an alternative to other art spaces. And I think writers and curators that come to the space see the programming that we're doing to be very much sort of comparable to what's happening in other spaces, except the physical architecture might be ever so slightly rougher. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny. It's similar to Ari. I was having a conversation with someone kind of a couple hours before this, and working through a similar thing. And I think I share a lot of those same things. I think the way that I kind of see towards operating is that we are responding to very specific circumstances, whether that be economic, whether that be scarcity of real estate, whether that be what was available to us at the time. We're responding to those, and similarly, we are kind of working with artists, working within our means, trying to kind of find, I don't think it's necessarily alternatives, I think we're just kind of figuring out ways to exist in the way that we best can and kind of serve the artists that we're working with in the best way possible. And I think, the only thing I struggle with this idea of alternatives is that there was one kind of static thing that we are the alternative to, and I think things are constantly in flux, they're constantly changing. I think new models are approaching and kind of developing, and I think that's really exciting. But yeah, I don't think I would necessarily self-describe as an alternative type of space.
Same for us. Especially, we're in the Belgo building. Our gallery looks like the others, who are mostly commercial or also artist centers. Our programming might be what is different from the conventional model, either from one of these categories. So, of course, we do offer to sell the work, so there is a commercial aspect, but and our programming isn't taught by a huge conseil d'administration council. So, and it's also very spontaneous. We follow a lot of artists in Canada, at the international, and whenever we feel like some work really talks to us and that something exciting is happening, we contact these artists and sometimes put them in relation with other artists, but organically. The model, the gallery also has been evolving organically, and I think that any larger commercial gallery was established all at once, and they probably all grew. And when I hear stories, I realize also that maybe it starts little with small. It starts with little and it becomes bigger. And I'm really sorry. I'm a really terrible public speaker, but. What was the question again? The new model, yes. Yeah, alternative space. It's pretty wide, What is an alternative space?
Did you want to add something, Marx?
Sure. So I think, so our space, again, because of the architecture and how it looks, I guess it does offer an alternative to some things. I don't know if I would classify it as an alternative space as it is, but yeah, it's not a gallery. It's not a white cube. Although some people have mentioned that, as you said, there's some white walls, and there's some kind of rough floors. But some people have actually mentioned like this kind of looks like in the lighting, right? So some people mentioned like it looks kind of like a white cube as well, which is not a lie sometimes, So I think it's flowy, as you were saying before, that it kind of really goes back and forth between, depending on what the show is like, what type of work are you showing, that can be alternative to whatever you can see in a commercial gallery or in an artist-run center now, which perhaps, we can dive deeper into that, because I think that's kind of like, now perhaps these spaces are alternative to the artist-run centers, which kind of like started like that, right? So in that sense, I do feel like new spaces, at least in Montreal. I'm still to discover some more in Toronto, but at least in Montreal, some spaces that I know of, Calaboose is one of them, Zoom.tw is another one. They do offer an alternative to certain models. And I guess our model is being developed on the go. So right now, it's really hard to really talk about what the model really is as it's been made, right? So I think, if I can add that to the conversation.
I like what Kevin said a minute ago, and I think that I've forgotten your exact words, but like finding a way to exist. I think that for the purposes of this panel, we're calling like alternative spaces is just sort of like a response to the reality of like how it's possible to not even necessarily make a living, but to work as an artist today. And so I think all of you guys are, starting projects that just make it possible to do that. I had some other questions planned, but I'm maybe gonna skip ahead from my scheduled options and ask you whether you see your space as, do you see it as were you planning for it to be temporary from the start, or are you interested in sort of eventually becoming established and sticking around? And if yes or no, sort of what direction you see your project moving in that way.
I don't have to start every time. Yeah.
I'm happy to jump in, or Julie, do you want to go ahead?
Go.
Sure. Okay. I think that's actually a really interesting question. I think I was talking with an artist that we've worked with in the past who I have a great deal of admiration for, and we kind of talked about this idea of, I think there's a lot of bias towards working towards a sort of permanence. And I think kind of also understanding that certain projects have certain lifespans and that you can walk away from something and kind of allow it to have been a thing that existed at a time. And then there's kind of a fluidity to that I think is really interesting. I think I'll speak for myself personally, I think for Towards, I think because it has taken different forms in the past, I imagine it will take different forms in the future. I don't know what that looks like, but I think, to me, I'm much more interested in this idea of how do you continue to work with artists to help develop the best types of projects and work, and how can you be in service of that work? And for right now, that means running a bricks and mortar space. Whether or not it will continue to look like that in the future, I'm not entirely sure. But I think if you kind of start from that place of being in service of helping the best art exist in the world with the people whose work you really admire and feel lucky to have the ability to work with, then if you start with that intention, I think you can kind of take that and run with it, and it can take a lot of different forms.
We were saying, we're always saying that as long as our heart is in it, we will make the best shows we can. And as long as the artists that we work with are telling us that they're happy, and they love the experience, and they're learning and sharing, then we'll keep going. But like Kevin, I don't see it as a rigid and linear. I see it as an evolution constantly. The form, how we will do it, how many exhibitions, if we decided to start representing artists, let's say, it's true, but we want to keep 70% of our programming by invitation, because I think that's what makes our project rich. It's the exchange, and also that allows the artists to work and meet in tangible manners and develop, real friendship or real exchange of ideas.
So if I can add something to that, it would be that in our case, it's very opportunity-based. We had the opportunity to start this project, and recently we had an open call for submissions that really allow us to really understand the need from the community to have access to an outlet to show. And so in that way, I don't think we're gonna run out of opportunities to show artists. But in the other side, life sometimes gets in the way. And so, yeah, sometimes you will have to change or manage the process a little bit differently. And, family issues, some things come up. And yes, perhaps that would be what would make these projects change. Now, in terms of making it something that is stable and it can run by itself, then that's probably not what we are at now. So that's the kind of like ephemeral side of this, that I can easily see ourselves running this space for a long time, but something can happen that we just stop it.
Right.
So yeah, in that sense, it's very light like that. It's very fragile like that.
So maybe to continue along the same line of inquiry, if the way you guys are working is a lot of a response to, just existing conditions, like the pressures of, real estate, just the fact that there's so many artists out there that need avenues to show their work. If for a minute you were doing totally blue sky thinking, what kind of space would you want to run if you weren't facing any of these pressures? Like if you could imagine the totally ideal way to show art, to make and distribute art, what would you think of? This is a huge question,
I think I can maybe pick up on the last question and sort of steer it into this a little bit. I think the thing that's sort of been motivating our program and motivating the evolution of the gallery has always really been a sense of curiosity about how to run a space, what does it look like to open a space, and there wasn't much of a long-term plan necessarily, except there's always a sense of what does this next opportunity look like if we explore it this way? What is it like for us to go do Papier in Montreal, and what is that experience? But one of the things, I don't exactly know where I was going with it, but is sort of as an alternative to more artist-run centers and commercial galleries, is this sense that there's more sort of latitude to respond really quickly to sort of emerging something that feels really urgent at the moment, or an artist practice that feels underrepresented. And so working outside of the artist-run center model, which often, because it's so tied to sort of government funding, there often requires a certain amount of lead time for projects and sort of reporting back. I remember as an artist doing projects in artist-run centers, you'd sort of apply to this call for submissions, and then that you'd be like, okay, here's your show 3 or 4 years from now. And then it doesn't feel like such an exciting project by the time you actually get to do it. And the same thing is sort of can be true, I suppose, of the opportunity when you're working at a commercial gallery and you have a roster of artists that are always sort of cycling through these shows. So I think what Julie had said about sort of dedicating 70% of the programming to projects is this sort of mobility to respond more quickly. And I think, not to sort of turn the question into to speak about what the architecture of a ideal space might be, but one that is sort of agile enough to sort of respond to things without so much lead time necessarily, so that it feels fresh and exciting for the artist. Having said that, because we share with Kevin, we only do a few shows a year, and now it has sort of gotten to the point where, because there's so many artists that we would like to work with, we kind of do have programming a year out, which I think was something that I intended to avoid at a certain point, but it's just sort of been the way that's evolved to a certain extent as well.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Because we can also move on.
Perhaps just about talking about, money is always an issue, but sometimes time also becomes an issue, in that you understand the will and the need for these shows to happen, and then it's impossible not to start planning ahead, right? So I think that's totally we agree with that for sure.
As an idea, I also think that it would be great if the artist could always be given kind of carte blanche also on what he wants to show. And that's something that we've been really trying to foster at the gallery. And I know that often enough, again, because of market and money, even the artists themselves may be producing differently because they know what people want. And I think it's really something that wouldn't exist at my ideal gallery.
I think that's sort of maybe one of the things that is an alternative or presents a certain alternative is that we've really tried to keep our operating costs as low as possible so that there's really, when we do a fair, yes, it's expensive to do a fair, so you are trying to sell work there, but in the physical exhibition space, we really do give sort of carte blanche, and that was the thing that I had really liked at G Gallery because it was affiliated with a university. There was no sort of need to sell anything ever. So artists were given so much sort of latitude in what they were able to do, and that is definitely something that we've tried to preserve in the project. There's no sort of like not much discussion about what it'll be or our expectations for the project ever. It's what's the most that you can get out of this exhibition.
And that's so enriching for everyone. And then, of course, always having, being very welcoming, and there's the education part. Like, we really like to engage with the community, with all of the visitors, and I think that sales are also important for the artists. Most of the time, to me, I'm always happy to sell a work because it's exciting for me, for the collector, but so much for the artist, and to place the work in a collection, whether it's public, private, or institutional, is something special. So I think that also needs to exist.
So when you guys each began your projects, did you see yourselves as looking to promote either something that was lacking in your scene or community, or a particular kind of art? Or even if not, when you look at your programming, do you see something that sort of like unifies the art that you've been showing?
I'm happy to jump in. So I think that's something that is constantly developing and shifting over time. One of the things I remember thinking about a lot when Aryen and I kind of opened up this collective space, I thought there was a number of really good, very thoughtful, kind of smaller, let's call them alternative exhibition spaces in Toronto at the time. But I felt that there was a real missing kind of link between smaller Toronto spaces that were able to highlight both Canadian artists, but also start to forge some international links. For people here who are a little bit more familiar with the Toronto community, a number of years ago, there was kind of a space that was pioneering in some ways, I would say, called Tomorrow. And that did a great job, I think, of kind of not only having some Toronto-Berlin dialogue, some Toronto-New York dialogue, and I think when they left there and moved to New York and kind of started new projects, I felt like there was a little bit of a hole, and that was something I was thinking about. How do you not only highlight the great talent that we have within the city, within Canada, but how do you get these young artists that are already thinking internationally, building communities internationally, forging these links? How do you get them to have exhibition opportunities within the city? And then that in turn allows Canadian artists to make links with these other individuals and go do shows in Berlin, go do shows in Vienna, go do shows in New York, do all those types of things. And that was really important. And I think one of the things I'm most happy about is it seems like there's been a lot of other spaces in Toronto that are now interested in doing that, and it's turning into a bigger thing.
So often, sorry, go ahead.
No, you start.
So often I get asked if our space promotes mostly Latin American art. I'm from Mexico, and some of my friends are too. And it so happened that a couple of the exhibitions that we had last year, there were some Latin American artists involved in it, but not really. I mean, it's happened that, you know, I do a lot of studio visits, and then we choose some shows, and we are wary of you know, we are actually conscious to try to get as inclusive as possible, that's for sure. But it doesn't have a mandate to be just one thing or the other. But definitely we are not concerned, but we are conscious about having a program that is inclusive as a whole, definitely.
So, either of you guys want to?
I feel like even just 4 years ago in Montreal, even the commercial galleries were not having as many interesting group shows, and also inviting artists from different communities to talk about, to gather and think about a specific theme. I think Montreal is more conceptual and austere and HD, and it's only one of the many sides. But I feel like things have changed and evolved already. For us, the identity of Pangée, I think, has always been a certain joie de vivre, personal narratives, the attention and to materiality, material-based, process-based practice.
I mean, when we first opened, one of the things that I thought we would do was have a certain focus on working with Canadian artists that had since left Canada and were working abroad. And we maybe did, of the 15 shows that we've done, maybe, I don't know, 5 to 8 of those have been that. But the sort of reality of working with artists that are outside of the city, there's just a lot of burden that gets placed on them because we don't have the resources to support that shipping and transportation all the time. So at first we tried to sort of work and do exhibitions around Canadian artists sort of visiting family back in Canada. There was an artist, Vanessa Disler, who we were able to time it around her sister's wedding. And we've tried to do shows in January when people are often home in December with artists that live elsewhere. But while that was sort of an impulse when we first opened, I don't know that we haven't sort of abandoned that already. So.
Well, that all leads kind of naturally into my next question, which was that I think that these kinds of spaces are particularly common and also particularly necessary outside of, like, you know, major global art centers. Like, you know, in New York, you have access to a giant art market and like major international museums, which is not necessarily as true in Toronto or Montreal or, you know, lots of smaller cities in Europe, for example. And so I wanted to ask you, in your space, sort of what's the balance between nurturing like a local scene and community and interfacing with an international one?
I mean, for us, I mean, most the artists that we've worked with are either part of my immediate community or like extended community. So friends of friends. Vanessa was the artist who I just mentioned, who we did the show at the timing of her sister's wedding. It was a case where I had seen her work because of this residence she was doing, and then saw that she was from Vancouver and knew that we would kind of have mutual friends because of the type of work she was doing and where she was from, and yeah. So for me, it's been really important to sort of give space to people that feel like they're in my community, but increasingly, it seems like there's the opportunity through the opportunities that have been presented to us to also take their work elsewhere. And I mean, I don't know if we talked about this at the beginning or if I mentioned it, but I, prior to opening the gallery, was calling myself an artist, or was working as an artist to a certain extent, and so I always try to sort of think about what opportunities would be really exciting to me as an artist. Like, what are the things that really were really meaningful and felt like you were really getting something out of an exhibition, whether that was having somebody write an interesting text about it, getting a review published somewhere, getting the opportunity to show your work outside of the city. And so the sort of interface is with international communities, I think, is a priority for the gallery, but mostly through bringing artists with sort of some connection to, not necessarily Toronto, but to Canada elsewhere.
I also think that it's really important when you go internationally to actually first be in touch with your own community. That's definitely also when you start with your community, your immediate community. That's how we started as well, and then extended. And I think also that because there's Instagram and Facebook, like there's a certain proximity. And funny, when we invited Les Ramsey to curate his show that's finished today at the gallery. Sorry you missed it, if you missed it. But yeah, it was really touching because there was some artists came from Vancouver and were meeting artists from Montreal that they had been following and been in conversation for over 7 years, even exchanged works over the time, but had never met in person. So I think that this also allowed us to discover and connect with, par exemple, Daniel Orchard, who we had a really fun time working with and brought internationally, and put in conversation with Vanessa Brown, who's a sculptor from Vancouver. So I think sometimes it's immediate and then not, but it feels immediate in a way.
In our case, it's mostly local so far, and I think it's because of all the things that you guys mentioned. It's just easier logistically, and also budgetary-wise. So yeah, definitely so far it's like that. We will have some international artists coming in the next season, but it's also within the close community of friends of friends or friends. So yeah, our interest lays so far really in developing the local community. Mm-hmm.
It also seems to me a bit that this kind of way of working is really enabled by the internet to a certain extent. Like the existence of social media and art blogs really facilitates the kinds of dialogue between spaces that all of you guys are involved in. I wonder if any of you could sort of comment on how that's impacted the way your gallery works.
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, just kind of maybe going to the last question and kind of how it feeds into this one, is that, obviously things like the internet, things like contemporary art blogs, things like Instagram, all of these have, a huge impact on visual culture and the way, people are looking at them and thinking about them when they make work, when they photograph work, all these types of things. But I think the thing that's kind of funny with that is that while that has really kind of proliferated everything, when I think about the artists that we've worked with internationally, I think similar to everyone here, from the sounds of it, it's always been through a friend of a friend of a friend, where it's like, for example, the artist that we're showing in the booth here, Tristan Unrau, is based in Los Angeles, but is originally from Vancouver, who was introduced to me from a childhood friend who now lives in Berlin. So it's kind of like those networks slowly build, and I think the more time you spend within your local community, it's kind of like those 6 degrees of separation, and people just start getting connected to other people and introduced to other people. So while I think there's no way to not think about and talk about kind of the importance of the interconnectedness of internet culture, in terms of actually the artists that we end up showing and the artists that we end up working with, it's 9 out of 10 times a much more personal relationship than having just seen their work somewhere.
Oops. And I wanted to add, for you coming from Toronto, that showing artists from Toronto really introduced me to your community that is wonderful, and inviting some of your artists to Montreal has been really enriching. for our community as well.
I think,
And
I mean, I guess maybe as we keep speaking, I keep trying to think back to like, what are the things that we're saying that sort of present some sort of alternative to where we all sort of disavowed the alternativeness of our spaces right off the bat. But there really feels like a good sense of camaraderie and openness to collaborate between spaces of this scale. Whether it be, I mean, Marx, we've only met in Toronto recently, but Julie and I we talk on the phone sometimes about things we're doing, which is really nice. And the other spaces in Toronto feel really open to, since we don't, maybe part of it is not having a roster of artists, but there's a real sort of sense of being willing to share the type of projects that we're working on with other spaces as well, that maybe can be harder to do when the cost of doing business is so high and the pressure to sort of hold on to what you have seems more desperate.
yeah, it's scary too. It's like, it's just, when you look at it, it seems like the bigger, the more successful, the more, you got to protect what you've built, and this is something that we really don't want to ever fall into. But yeah, I feel it.
It's like a tightening down.
Like other commercial galleries have been really, really generous with it, and I think that's one of the reasons also, because we promote artists that are emerging, yeah, I guess for them they see what they can do with even small budget and yeah, so it's beneficial because then they know where to find new practices also that are serious.
So do you think then that the work that you've been doing has sort of a knock-on effect that you see around you in other spaces?
Yeah, definitely, and I'm proud of it. I'm really happy. It seems also that we are useful to the artists.
When you say knock-on effect, you mean to other sort of spaces of this scale, or to sort of more established?
Both to some extent, but like especially within maybe more established spaces.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've made it a priority to sort of use tools like social media and contemporary art blogs, sort of made it a priority to disseminate the projects that we're doing through those. And we don't have like a really extensive list of collectors that we would email about an exhibition. But we have like a extensive list of blogs that we'll email and let them know. And so when we work with an artist that might have representation elsewhere, they probably in another city, they do sort of see that benefit in that space as well. So in that sense, yeah, we're doing some work for them as well. Yeah.
So then, since, I mean, obviously, like, financial and budgetary concerns are sort of unavoidable in this whole discussion, but none of you guys are, like, 100% a strictly commercial enterprise, but also none of you are not a commercial enterprise entirely either. So I'm just sort of curious about what are the avenues that you're looking at in order to, like, fund and make your project sustainable?
That's a good question. I think that's important to talk about that because, that's the main reason why some people perhaps don't start these spaces because of budgetary reasons, right? As we've been saying along this hour, we try to keep the cost really low as possible. So, you find spaces like a garage or something like that to really make it work. In our case, specific case, all the budget and all the really what keeps it alive is our salaries. Really, we don't really have another stream of income or anything. So we keep this as as manageable as possible, and we know that it also has a cap. We cannot really continue without stop paying the rent, our rent. So then that's going to be a problem, right? So that's always something important to have a conversation about these spaces. Now, we are not against having a revenue from it, never. If there's interest in what we are doing, really not chasing the market, but if there's an interest from that, for sure. I mean, of course, we'll be happy to do that. being a non-for-profit is not something that we have explored yet. And it's funny because to access to some grants from the Art Council of Canada or something, you need to be either a non-for-profit or a commercial gallery, which is funny. You need to be a commercial gallery to get access to grants. And so, yeah, there's nothing really accessible for projects in the space where we are. And so, yeah, it all comes from there in our particular space. So I think we are really proud of that, but we're also, concerned that, no concern again. We are conscious that we have a limit to that. Yeah. And so the shows and everything that we plan has to be always being filtered through that.
Personally, we've been really lucky. So we also incorporated the gallery so that we could ask for grants. And we've been really lucky that the Canadian Art Council has been supporting the gallery. So they, it will give us enough funds to ship works from Vancouver or from New York. And so sometimes as special projects within the gallery, exhibition projects, or art fairs at the International. But yeah, before we incorporated, we're like, oh, it's heavy. Then you have to, be a business. But sadly, we should inform them. We should write them a letter.
I think for us, one of the things that is really interesting about the project is sort of seeing how it looks after 2 or 3 or 4 years. So just the idea of extending the project for as long as possible has been a real priority. So I always have, ambitions to sort of do something bigger with the project, but I know that as soon as, if we took on a larger space, we'd close 3 months later. So I asked my partner to just remind me to not do that regularly. Because as artists always sort of are giving a portion of their whatever source of income they have over to a studio space. So I opened the space in lieu of renting a studio. So we've always tried to keep the cost of the space comparable to what a studio rental might be, which is probably not enough to really run a space, which is how we ended up splitting it over 2 spaces. So it's a manageable cost, or one that I'd factored into my life prior, is that I would spend a certain amount of money each month on a studio, and that has just sort of transitioned into being a gallery now.
I think we're getting a little bit close to the end, so maybe we can close on a really positive note, and you guys can tell me about what you are most proud of in having operated your space so far, like whether it's a particular project or like something about your gallery.
Oh, I know mine. It's that there's 2 galleries that opened in Toronto really recently, Carl Louis and Cassandra, that are using the same model that we felt like we invented at the time. I don't know if we actually did or not, but it's just nice to see that the solution that we came up to dealing with that sort of problem of real estate has been adopted by somebody else, and so it's allowed sort of 2 spaces to now exist in Toronto. I'm sure they would have figured out another way to do it, but that they thought that our model was working well enough and was something that they felt manageable and made opening their galleries in Toronto sort of accessible. So that feels really good. I mean, I think we could close knowing that somebody else had sort of picked that project up, and that it had at least some sort of legacy in that respect. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, not to just piggyback on that, but I think having conversations with people and hearing about their kind of interests and ambitions to open spaces in Toronto in, what might have used to be considered not a quote-unquote suitable space for art, or not somewhere that you would traditionally find art. I think feeling like there has been a real community of people that have kind of banded together and decided that even with kind of all these odds stacked against them, that they were willing to kind of go out there and try and open up new spaces, show new projects, support artists, broaden the conversation. All of these things I think are so important, and to play a very kind of small role in that is something we're very happy to do and hope to be able to continue to do for a long time.
I guess I'm more happy than proud. But, we've been there for 3 good years and fostered so many different dialogues and practices, and I've learned so much. It's extremely nourishing, and I hope that I helped different artists also to get recognition and to meet other artists and take part in communities, and that's maybe something to be proud of.
Right, for us it would be definitely community forming. We are really proud that when people come to TAP, there's something there that happens that is promotes that type of sharing and developing of perhaps ideas or some communication between artists and people involved, and also I would say the allowance that we really give to artists in terms of experimentation. So we really have that as a real center in our, if we can call it, we don't really have a mandate, but if we could call it like that, it would be do something that you don't know what the result will be. If you know what the result will be, that's not an experiment. And that comes from my kind of like thing. But yeah, so it is that feeling of do something that is risky, there's like really low stakes here. Just try something out.
Great, well, thanks, everybody. I think we can take questions at this point.
Hello. I attend a lot of these panels where people talk about alternative spaces and project spaces, and I'm based in the UK. And I just have a question, which is quite a general question, but is this still truly an alternative space in this kind of platform, while at the same time you're connected to the commercial scene, the international art world? What actually makes it alternative? Because I see this as replicating other models that exist in the art world, and actually they're not alternative anymore.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like to a certain extent, we all to a certain extent, none of us identify as alternative spaces. Was sort of how we opened the conversation, was that we all found it would be really hard to say that we were that, because I think we feel like, or I won't speak for everybody, but at least the sense that I got off the bat was that it's a shared sort of feeling that we do feel very much like maybe at a certain point it was peripheral to a center, but the center expands so rapidly that we very much feel not alternative and often hardly on the periphery.
Doesn't really answer the question, though. Does anyone else have anything to say to that? Because obviously you can argue that you're on the periphery, but you're meandering between this model of being a commercial space, which I also think is not fixed anymore, and it's certainly very transitory, and there are lots of spaces that I know, at least in Europe, that move between project space, commercial space, residency, production, and this is very fluid at the same time, but there's often this rhetoric about being alternative and distinguished from the big bad institution, but at the same time you're operating in a space which allows you to be alternative because you don't quite fit into any of the current cartographies.
Sure. I guess I would just say that obviously this sounds like it comes down to a definition and how you choose to define what is alternative. And so, I mean, I don't know what, again, I would say that for me personally, I don't want to speak for anyone else here, but I would never self-identify as an alternative space. I would say that we are a small gallery that does not have a roster of artists. We work on a project-by-project basis, and kind of to the first comments, we find ways to exist and to hopefully keep the project going on, and sometimes that takes more of a commercial form, sometimes it takes less of a commercial form, but we're really just we're a space to show art in Toronto.
If I can just follow quickly up on that, in that sense, we really don't we don't use the word gallery for a space, and it may be just because of architecture, really, because it's a garage where we have, and it looks like one. And so really what makes it similar to other spaces is how we run it. So yeah, that model is perhaps similar to that, so to other galleries. So yeah, you're right. I mean, it's really hard to say I'm an alternative space. Also, talking in this context, right? The context of a fair. So yeah, how alternative can be. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and also I think that there are lots of art spaces, particularly on the commercial scene, that also try and adopt some of the alternative methodologies. This is also this is moving, and perhaps it hasn't in the last 20 or 30 years or so. But I'll stop and let somebody else speak.
It's all right. Is there anybody else who want to ask a question to our panelists? Don't be shy. I think it's a wrap, guys. Thank you so much
thank you.
for being here. Thanks.
Thanks,
Have a
man.
great day, everybody.